Hello, and welcome back to the Caliphs, the rise and fall of Arab power. My name is Zaid Wahab, and today we're going to cover the messy end of al-Muqtadir's reign. Having filled his administration with flunkies and sycophants, the Abbasid government was ill-suited to the task of addressing the symptoms of its own dysfunction. After over 2 decades of ruinous leadership, the state's treasury was exhausted, and its troops and commanders increasingly restive, all while the caliph himself was utterly disconnected from the issues plaguing the ummah. His general Mu'nis held things together for as long as he could, but continued mismanagement in the face of a worsening security situation would push the indefatigable commander beyond his limits. Episode 85. Third time's the charm. I'd like to open our episode today with a correction regarding what I said about my parents bribing a man of God when they got married. Having discussed it with them, it turns out sectarianism was never the issue. The problem lay with the fact that my mother was Lebanese while my father was Iraqi. Back then, he would have had to get approval from his government to marry a foreigner abroad, and Dad wasn't on excellent terms with the Ba'ath Party. Matrimony is a religious affair in Lebanon, as the country does not recognize civil unions. So my folks had to incentivize a sheikh to disregard my dad's nationality in order to officiate their marriage. I was wrong to blame the systemic hiccup on sectarianism. The true culprit was Arab authoritarianism all along. Anyway, I don't think this is the Arab history any of you have in mind when you tune in. So let's turn our attention to more pertinent material. This will be our final episode on al-Muqtadir. We went through his many wazirs to detail the spread of corruption through the civil bureaucracy, and covered the military triumphs that held the caliphate together despite its slow decline. Today, we're going to backtrack a few years and open our discussion with the resurgence of the Qaramita, a topic we briefly touched on last time. Their invasion of Iraq went beyond the usual brutality. It kicked off a chain reaction that culminated in disaster for the Abbasid caliph. I'm not sure there's any need to reintroduce the Qaramita, so I'll keep this part brief. The term started out as a pejorative to disparage those who believed in the eminent appearance of an Ismaili end-of-times savior in Iraq, followers of a rabble-rouser dubbed Qarmat. The Qaramita we're concerned with at this point were a very different bunch of Ismailis, though. They were a collection of Arab tribes that resided around Bahrain, which back then stretched along the entire eastern coast of the Arabian Peninsula, from Kuwait all the way down to Oman. Originally united by the warlord-like figure of Abu Sa'id al-Jannabi, they split off from the rest of the Ismaili community in 899 after rejecting the Fatimid heir. After Abu Sa'id's death in 914, his son Abu Tahir eventually took the reins when he came of age. He proved to be a bloodletter, and it was during his tenure that the group earned its eternal infamy in Arab eyes. The Qaramita will serve as our antagonists for the day, but we are particularly interested in how their onslaughts against the Abbasid Caliphate impacted the relationship between General Mu'nis and al-Muqtadir. The resurgence of the Qaramita coincided with the ascension of the vicious teen-aged Abu Tahir in 923. His first year in charge, he sacked the city of Basra but otherwise he returned the group to their raids of the pilgrim caravans as they made their way across the desert to Mecca. The Abbasids could not repel nor punish these attacks, and the state's failure to keep the pilgrims safe in 924 led to the downfall of the Wazir ibn al-Furat. The royal court began to take the Qaramita a lot more seriously after that. The new Wazir failed to make any tangible progress, though. Despite providing the pilgrims with an escort of 6,000 men, the Hajj caravans were attacked again in 925. The Abbasids paid the Qaramita an untold sum of money to allow the pilgrimage to go ahead in the next couple of years. They couldn't afford to do the same in 928, so the Hajj was simply cancelled and no caravans were sent from Baghdad. As you can probably imagine, this was a pretty big deal. Not religiously, of course. Anyone who showed up at Mecca could go about the pilgrimage with no problem. But this might be the first time that a member of the ruling clan wasn't dispatched from the capital to represent the caliph. That the Abbasids couldn't afford to bribe the Qaramita to keep the peace is even more concerning. In fact, it only gets worse the closer we look at what was going on inside the administration. The caliph was entirely checked out, and the responsibility for countering the Qaramita fell to the Wazir instead. After all, Ibn al-Furat was punished for not paying enough attention to the insurgents, so it only stands to reason that his replacement would be expected to do better. The next Wazir was the one who came up with the terrible idea of promising the governor of Azerbaijan, Yusuf ibn Abi Saj, all the revenue collected from the east in 926 in exchange for dealing with the troublesome Arab raiders. This offer was too good to pass up, so in the spring of 927, Yusuf took about 8,000 of his Caspian and Central Asian troops and occupied the fort town of Wasit in Iraq. The problem was that by then the Wazir had changed, twice. The latest Wazir was Ibn al-Jarrah, and he understood how ill-suited Yusuf's mountain fighters and cavalry were for facing nomadic warriors in the desert. He'd recalled Mu'nis to defend the capital, but then had to send him out again to face the Byzantines in modern-day Turkey. Ibn al-Jarrah's long-term plan to counter the Qaramita was to cobble together and fund a small coalition of neighboring Arab tribes to act as a buffer along the caliphate's desert border. It was a wise idea, tried and true, employed by all the imperial states that had preceded the caliphate. Despite repeated entreaties from the court in Baghdad, Yusuf refused to abandon his campaign and return to his lands. He insisted on staying until the wealth he had been promised was collected and delivered to him. Worse still, his troops cared little for the caliphate, and their abuse of local populations completely disrupted tax collection in central Iraq, one of the few provinces the treasury could reliably depend on. While Yusuf's army waited in Wasit, the Qaramita were gearing up for a raid into the Abbasid heartland of Iraq. 2,500, their largest band yet, launched an invasion in Ramadan that year, so around November of 927. Instead of their usual target of Basra, they attacked Kufa, where the Abbasids had stockpiled equipment for Yusuf's troops to use in their campaign against them. Local supporters made it easy for the Qaramita to take over Kufa without much of a fight. After they'd outfitted themselves with the weapons meant for his troops, Yusuf finally mobilized to meet the Qaramita, either embarrassed into action or because he figured he stood a better chance of receiving his reward if he actually did something to earn it first. Yusuf enjoyed an overwhelming numerical advantage, and his army outnumbered their opponents at least 3-1, and possibly more like 5-1. He surrounded Kufa on a Friday and declared that the Qaramita had until Sunday to surrender and hand over their leader Abu Tahir, or else there'd be war. They replied saying there was no need to wait, and they attacked his larger army on Saturday morning. The fighting lasted all day, and by the end of it, Abu Tahir personally led a small group, raided Yusuf's camp, and took the governor captive. The defeat of Yusuf's army was entirely unexpected, and panic spread like wildfire across Iraq. It seems like many civilians even abandoned Baghdad and made their way east, expecting the capital to fall next. It may sound crazy to think that an army of less than 3,000 men could conquer a city of about 1 million people, but it wasn't completely unfounded. Their surprise victory in Kufa had emboldened all sorts of anti-Abbasid elements in society, and we hear of over 10,000 people openly declaring their support for the Qaramita. A mole was even discovered at the royal court, a disaffected official who had informed Abu Tahir about the military stockpile in Kufa. When he confessed, he justified his disloyalty by saying he could no longer stand idly by as al-Muqtadir corrupted the Ummah. The Qaramita were making the Abbasid caliphate look like a paper tiger, and its collapse must have felt eminently possible at the time, even if it seems a little unrealistic from our far-removed vantage point. Mu'nis was recalled from the fight against the Byzantines and tasked instead with thwarting the Qaramita's advance. He brought the Hamdanid chief with him, and the two of them took charge of the defense of Baghdad. Several reports claim that Mu'nis had over 40,000 troops at his disposal, but if that's true, then the vast majority were neither tested in war nor equipped for it. The army that Mu'nis usually commanded was 9,000 strong. A few thousand came with Abdullah ibn Hamdan, and the rest were probably policemen, guards, and a hastily assembled assortment of fresh conscripts. Although Mu'nis still had an overwhelming numerical advantage over the Qaramita, he decided not to roll the dice the way Yusuf had. Instead of mobilizing to meet them in battle outside Baghdad, he sent sappers to demolish the dams west of the city and flood the plains that their enemy would have to ride through to reach it. Others were sent to destroy bridges and any other infrastructure which facilitated military logistics. The strategy proved highly effective, and when Abu Tahir set out for Baghdad in January 928, he couldn't find a way to reach it. His army was even split on either side of the Euphrates for a while, but the Abbasids failed to take advantage, and a good opportunity to wipe them out was wasted. Unable to assault the capital, the Qaramita executed Yusuf and turned north, rampaging through Mesopotamia instead. A couple cities managed to resist them, but the wider countryside was plundered by Abu Tahir's bunch over the next 6 months. Towards the end of summer, the Qaramita finally withdrew back to the desert, promising to return for the caliph another day. What an unmitigated disaster, am I right? Not only did the caliphate fail to stop a few thousand nomadic Vandals from ravaging their capital province, they just cowered in Baghdad for over half a year and waited for them to leave. The damage to Abbasid standing was quite severe, and even worse was the economic damage done to their realm. The Qaramita destroyed and depopulated much of Iraq, leaving the capital without a reliable source of grain or tax revenue. The financial situation worsened, and recriminations abounded at the caliph's court. The blame game at this time was quite frenetic, and it's difficult to keep up with, so I'm going to try and ignore the noise and focus solely on the stuff that matters to us. Basically, the Wazir, Ibn al-Jarrah, was placed under arrest and replaced by one of the Queen Mother's agents, Ali ibn Muqla. It seems that Shaghab demanded that she be compensated for funding part of the war effort. See, the treasury was empty throughout the entirety of the Qaramita's campaign, and the Wazir had to request the royal family help finance Baghdad's defense. Now that he couldn't pay her back, she pressed the caliph to punish Ibn al-Jarrah, and al-Muqtadir, ever the good son, could not refuse his mother. So instead of focusing on addressing his administration's many problems, the caliph completely ignored the close call his dynasty had somehow survived and returned to business as usual. Nothing is more on brand for al-Muqtadir than firing the only guy who was actually doing his job. Multiple accounts allege that Mu'nis protested against Ibn al-Jarrah's removal, leading the caliph to begin considering replacements for him as well. In April 929, the general heard that the caliph was about to empower one of his Abbasid kin over the entire military. Mu'nis rode to the capital, accompanied by his loyal troops and commanders, and marched right into the royal palace. Al-Muqtadir's guards were so terrified that they simply fled without a fight. The caliph was apprehended during his supper, along with his mother and their entourage. It was an extremely fluid situation, and the next thing we are told is that Mu'nis fetched Al-Muqtadir's younger brother, Muhammad, dubbed him Al-Qahir, and declared him to be the Ummah's latest caliph. This was on a Saturday. On Sunday, the Wazir, still Ibn Muqla, wrote missives to the other provinces announcing the change at the top. On Monday, the day public pledges were meant to be accepted, the troops showed up at court demanding the customary bonus that came with the ascension of a new caliph. They had probably not been paid for a while, and since the new administration had been bequeathed an empty treasury, no awards could be granted. The troops rioted and decided they preferred the old rich caliph to this new poor one. They made their way to Mu'nis's home where Al-Muqtadir was being held and released him from his captivity. They carried the Abbasid all the way back to the royal palace, where Al-Muqtadir promptly undid everything that had happened over that weekend. He rewarded the troops for their loyalty, pardoned and dismissed his little brother, then had the Wazir inform other provinces of his restoration. He was now the only caliph to survive 2 separate coups against his administration. It's not entirely clear where Mu'nis was during these chaotic days. Some accounts make it sound like he left Baghdad right after instigating the coup, while others say he was at home when the mob came to liberate Al-Muqtadir. Wherever he was, I'm sure he was frantically searching for money, though it doesn't sound like he found any. Before you judge him for his failure, know that there's good reason to believe that this is what he wanted all along. Despite the flop, Mu'nis was still an indispensable figure. It didn't matter that Al-Muqtadir feared his power and could no longer trust him. The troops would not have let the caliph harm their beloved commander. So the 2 men came to an understanding. Al-Muqtadir would stay in power, since apparently only he could access the wealth he and his mother had pilfered from the state over the years. In return, Mu'nis would have the final say on all positions of influence. He chose the Wazir, the Hajib, and the head of the palace guard, installing his own loyalists to keep an eye on the administration. This fragile balance was never going to last, however. The corrupt royal family controlled all the money, and it was clear to everyone that they longed to rid themselves of the all-powerful general. The men Mu'nis placed in charge were repeatedly approached with tempting offers of wealth and prestige, and eventually they began to crack. The wazir was replaced, while the hajib and the head of Baghdad's security both defected from Mu'nis's camp and began plotting against him. These men, Muhammad ibn Yaqut and Muhammad ibn Ra'iq, will both be notable figures down the line, but not while Mu'nis was still around. By late 931, the tables had suddenly turned on the general, and al-Muqtadir had enough support at court to force him out of the capital. Mu'nis's home was ransacked, and the chief of security, Muhammad ibn Yaqut, was announced as the new head of the caliph's armies. This triumphalism in Baghdad was entirely premature, however, for Mu'nis was not done yet. He still commanded the loyalty of several thousand troops, and they followed him north into Mesopotamia. Some accounts make it sound like he conquered these lands, but it's more likely that he was welcomed by his ally Abdullah ibn Hamdan, and the two began to plan their response. It took them about a year, but by the early fall of 932, they had recruited an army large enough to confidently march back to the capital. The caliph ordered his troops to prepare to defend Baghdad, but they clamored for pay. He may not have had enough, or perhaps they simply knew that they were not up to the task of facing the legendary Mu'nis in battle, because many abandoned the caliph's army before the campaign. The caliph's new general, Muhammad ibn Yaqut, advised al-Muqtadir to personally attend the battle, saying the sight of their caliph in his war gear would spur the entire ummah to his defense. This was terrible advice, something only an unctuous yes-man could come up with. Al-Muqtadir had no business being anywhere near a battlefield. The caliph's forces melted away at the sight of Mu'nis's army, and even Muhammad ibn Yaqut absconded without a fight. Al-Muqtadir was not so lucky. The battle was so disorganized that some of Mu'nis's newly recruited Berber troops chanced upon the caliph's entourage. They quickly defeated his guards, beheaded the caliph, and looted his camp so thoroughly that al-Muqtadir was left a naked, headless corpse on the field. We find plenty of accounts lamenting his undignified end, but we can't say for sure that this was the conclusion that Mu'nis was after. Let's take some time to digest all this disarray before we proceed with our history any further. The caliph has just been killed by his military, something that hasn't happened since the dark days of the anarchy over 60 years ago. Back then, it ushered in an extended period of, anarchy, with a string of puppet caliphs championed and killed with the shifting fortunes of the all-powerful commanders of their armies. Things were alarmingly similar during al-Muqtadir's final year. It's not just that the army had moved against the Abbasid caliph. The military itself was no longer united. Although Mu'nis was now the undisputed power in the land, the faction that had betrayed him and worked with the caliph was still at large. Muhammad ibn Yaqut didn't surrender after al-Muqtadir's defeat. He fled to Wasit along with one of the caliph's sons and many of his partisans. They remained on the run, waiting for an opening that could lead them back to power. Mu'nis didn't need to worry about Ibn Yaqut's faction just yet, because it wasn't all that large. Luckily, he no longer had to worry about the Qaramita either. The mayhem in Iraq presented them with the perfect opportunity to reinvade the province, but the Bahraini bunch had sort of imploded on their own in 931. A bizarre tale well worth distracting ourselves with. Even though the Qaramita had refused to acknowledge the Fatimid caliph as Ismail's true heir, their doctrine still held that an end-of-times figure would emerge to guide the chosen. In 930, they may have reasoned that in order to expedite his appearance, a decisive break must be made with the past. Instead of their usual sacrilege of attacking pilgrims on their way to or from the Hajj, they decided to go all out and assault Mecca itself during the pilgrimage. They murdered attendees and desecrated the well of Zamzam by tossing their corpses inside. They destroyed the Kaaba, the birthplace of Islam, and carried off its revered black stone to their capital in Bahrain. Their violation of Islam's holiest site sealed their reputation in Arab and Muslim memory, and cost them all their supporters across the realm. The story doesn't end there. When Abu Tahir returned home, he identified a recently enslaved captive from Iran as the true Mahdi, or chosen one. That guy turned out to be a Zoroastrian priest, and he immediately abolished all Muslim rituals and replaced them with ancient Persian practices. The Qaramita put up with 2 or 3 months of this before second-guessing whether or not they'd picked the right savior. They decided to test their Mahdi. When he ordered that a number of his enemies be rounded up and killed, the Qaramita secretly inserted his mother into the tent that held them. They then asked him again whether everyone in the tent should be put to death, and when he confirmed his initial orders, they declared that he had unwittingly disproven his supposed infallibility. The Qaramita backtracked into Islam after killing the pretender that they'd picked, but they were never again accepted by the wider Ummah. Anyway, Mu'nis didn't need to worry about Muhammad ibn Yaqut, nor the Qaramita. All he had to worry about was gold. The financial aspect is the other critical takeaway from this Abbasid collapse. Corruption had hollowed out the state, leaving the ruling family and their cronies with enormous wealth. The widening rift between them and their increasingly impoverished subjects gave them an outsized influence which could be mistaken for real power. Al-Muqtadir's fortune had essentially resurrected his authority after the second coup, but it couldn't save him from the third. His successor faced the unenviable challenge of restoring order to the realm with an empty treasury. We'll have to take a tour of the wider caliphate to understand why nowhere else was contributing. The tax collection in Iraq had been severely impacted by the raids of recent years. For all intents and purposes, Al-Muqtadir's successor was Mu'nis. Obviously, only Abbasid could be caliph, and we'll talk more about Al-Muqtadir's actual heir, his little brother Al-Qahir, next time. But we've seen this situation before. When an Abbasid is installed like this, his first and foremost task is to reclaim true authority. His legitimacy would remain nominal until he overcame those who had dared to pick the Ummah's caliph. Until he succeeded in this, the prospect of civil strife hung over the caliphate like a black cloud. So long as ultimate authority was out of the caliph's hands, ordinary men would aspire and compete for it, even at the expense of the entire realm. We'll leave these daunting obstacles for our next episode. Let's spend the rest of our time together reflecting on Al-Muqtadir and contextualizing his role in the long arc of Abbasid history. I think he's a serious candidate for worst caliph ever. There were terrible ones before him and others since, but the amount of damage he did to his dynasty over his long reign was truly devastating. The caliph's age is the most common explanation we find for his abject failure as a leader, and with good reason too. Al-Muqtadir was 13 when he ascended the throne, and he stayed in power for a record 24 years, longer than any caliph before him. This means that he was only 37 when he died in battle. Al-Muqtadir's youth meant that he was completely dependent on his mother, and she abused her influence over him, normalizing corruption across the administration at previously unimaginable levels. Although the accounts we find in our sources have grown more factual as we progressed through our history, stories of graft during Al-Muqtadir's reign are so fantastic that they're truly difficult to take seriously. The guy is said to have kept 11,000 eunuchs, a number so large I don't even know what to do with it. Eunuchs are typically used to serve in a harem, which makes the number even more absurd. 11,000 is more than half the population of Paris at the time, and 2,000 more than the number of troops in the caliphate's largest army. Ibn Miskawayh, writing 50 years after Al-Muqtadir's reign and relying on court documents, calculated that the caliph wasted over 80 million gold dinar. Considering that Mu'nas's army cost 600,000 dinar a year, this conservative estimate of waste implies that the state could have comfortably financed a professional military of 50,000 instead, or invested in infrastructure to stem agricultural decline. The administration's priorities lay elsewhere, however. The Queen Mother Shahab and her son emptied the treasury and packed the bureaucracy with sweet-talking conmen, enablers who were eager to help embezzle more so long as they got to fill their own pockets in the process. When I try to think of other terrible caliphs to compare to Al-Muqtadir, the only two that come to mind are Al-Amin and the Umayyad Al-Walid ibn Yazid. All three knew they would become caliphs at a young age, though only Al-Muqtadir rose to power as a child. The expectation seems to inevitably breed a sense of entitlement, the inevitability of their fate leaving them unconcerned with preparing for the role. Al-Muqtadir didn't only do the most damage because he ruled the longest. The timing of his unfortunate reign was ruinous for the foundering caliphate. You might think it's unfair to describe it as foundering, given that his brother, father, and grandfather had all worked hard to restore it to a lost glory. But it was still in a critical state, as it had many structural challenges which required an engaged and creative leader to resolve. There was the issue of re-establishing a link between the caliph and his armies, now that Samarra had been abandoned. There was the irreversible decline in agricultural output in Iraq and the increasingly wayward governors of other realms. There was the Ismaili Da'wah, which had by this point already birthed a rival caliphate. There was the challenge of properly reintegrating Egypt and the Syrian coast after they'd been governed by the independent Tulunid dynasty for a generation. These obstacles would have vexed even a political genius like Al-Mansur, and they were totally ignored by his unworthy descendant, to the detriment of the dynasty, and indeed the entire realm. True to form, our histories heap praise on Al-Muqtadir. I guess I'm being imprecise with language here. It's just that any praise for this undeserving figure feels like a heap to me. However, since hard times lay ahead, accounts look back lovingly at his reign as a time when the Abbasid caliph wielded actual power. It's a little unhinged to read through, honestly. Al-Muqtadir is described as compassionate and pious, and his ill-gotten wealth is willfully conflated with prosperity. I think we've covered him closely enough to see through such fawning eulogizing, and we'll witness the true consequences of his mismanagement together, next time, here on The Caliphs, the rise and fall of Arab power.